everyone, glad to have you back. If you're new here, I'm Tanya. I'm really glad you stopped by. We're not in my garden today, we're in my kitchen, and I have two projects that I'd like to do today. First, I want to preserve these beans that I received from my co-op in last week's pickup. I want to get these pressure canned and stocked up in my pantry. And this second project I want to do is actually move my pantry today and set up a brand new one in my basement. So those are two things I'd like to do. But before I jump into the projects, I want to talk a little bit about this series called Preserving the Harvest. While I am primarily a gardening channel, from time to time you will see me in my kitchen preserving the fruits of my labor, either from my garden or that have been supplemented to me through my co-op, which I subscribe to as well. I think just showing the full life cycle of the planting of the vegetable from seed all the way through harvest and preservation is a really fun thing to experience and is a great way for me to share how I utilize all the foods that we plant out in my garden and how we make use of them during the really cold months in winter. And also it's a fun thing to do during winter when it's, sub-zero temperatures out right now. I received these dry beans and I knew it was the perfect time to take advantage of this. Before we pressure can these beans together, I want to talk about the second project that we'll be doing together, which is setting up my new pantry in the basement. I recently did a video where I toured my pantry that is currently in the corner of my children's playroom in the basement, right at the foot of our stairs. While it's perfect for me in that it's visible from upstairs, I can quickly look down and see what I have on hand. It's not an ideal location because jars may be inadvertently knocked over. And that would be a shame because so much work goes into preserving those items. So I want to actually get a designated space for my pantry in the back storage area right next to our refrigerator. So that is the project we'll be doing together. And I'm really excited because one of my goals for 2025 is to become much more intentional about preserving foods that I grow, preserving foods that I supplement to our household from a local farm here through our co-op. I really want to kind of get more into the active preservation, either via canning or freezing or dehydrating, whatever it might be, just so that I have more on hand and so I can over time stockpile up a nice supply of food year round that we have access to throughout the colder months. So I'm really excited to get a new pantry set up, and right now let's dive into the beans. So I've been soaking these beans overnight, and I know there are different methods of preserving beans. I follow the method that is safe and approved by the Food Center Preservation Association, I believe it is. I did soak these overnight. I know that they also have a quick soak method that is deemed safe, but I wanted to reduce as much starch as possible from these beans and just to reduce some of the digestive issues that come with them. So these have been soaking now for about 18 hours. Here we have pinto beans as well as white beans. And what I need to do now is clean out some of the debris that has floated to the top. I need to really pick through these and make sure that they are clean and ready to be processed. So let's go ahead and do that together. I am actually going to try two different methods to pressure can these. I have soaked them, like I mentioned, overnight, but there are two different ways I can go from here. I could boil them for 30 minutes and then drain the water, put them into the jar all the way, and then fill that with warm water or boiling water, and then place them in the canner at that point. Or I can skip the boiling for 30 minutes, place about a half to 2/3 of a cup of the beans that have been soaking in a jar, and fill that with boiling water and pressure can it that way. There are mixed opinions about which method is best and results in the best bean. For the purposes of what I'll be using these beans for, they will likely result in either soups or refried beans. So I don't mind if they become slightly soft. I know that's kind of the contentious point, right? Is that they become too mushy when boiled. So I'm going to try both just as an experiment to see which one we like better. I don't think I will be seasoning these. I might add a little bit of salt because I like to have the option to season them at the time of cooking because I'm not sure what I'm going to be using them for. So you can add seasonings immediately like cumin, black pepper, salt to make them more of a refried bean flavor. I'm going to go ahead and get my water cooking. And because I'm going to be boiling some of these beans for 30 minutes, I want to get a pot of water going as well. I'm going to go ahead and start with my white beans here. It's very clear to me there's a lot of debris in here that needs to be picked out. And since it's just risen to the surface, I'm just going to go ahead and pick it out just like this. I think that might be a little bit easier, but basically you want to check for rocks, any floating things that are not beans because these are harvested and bagged up dry. Um, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that, and then I will rinse these. You do not want to use the water that they've been soaking in to boil them and pressure can them. Um, the water really contains all the starches that were released from the beans when they were soaked overnight. And that reduces a lot of the gas buildup that occurs when beans are consumed. And that's one of the common complaints of eating them. So by soaking them, we get rid of those starches. So definitely you don't want to eat or use this water rather to cook. I'm also getting rid of any beans that are soft, um, or that have burst open. That is something I do not want to do. In fact, I'm thinking there are a few kidney beans in here because these beans are bright red, which is interesting. So that must have just been kind of some leftover when they harvest them at the farm that got mixed into this bag. I'm also seeing some black beans. So it might just be a few others that got mixed in there. But most importantly, like getting out the twigs. I'm finding quite a few twigs here. So one thing I'm already noticing is that some of these beans are actually quite soft already from having been soaked for 18 hours now. So that tells me that if I boil these and pressure can them, they will likely be incredibly soft. So it's just something I want to keep in mind as I kind of approach these two different methods. Um, and just something to keep in mind for you, depending on what you'll be using beans for. All right, next up, the pinto beans. These look much cleaner. I've got one big wood chip in there, but aside from that, the beans look a lot cleaner than the white beans. They are also pretty soft already, the pinto beans. So I know pinto beans are very commonly used for refried beans, so that would be perfect. And I really don't see much debris that's floated to the top. You also want to pick out any beans that might have black spots on them or are very squishy to the touch that just don't feel like they are good anymore. You want to go ahead and remove those as well. And then in addition to draining the liquid that was used to soak in the beans, you also want to rinse the beans really well. This just removes any of that starch that is clinging to the beans, as well as any debris. And these beans look pretty clean. I think they're pretty much ready to go. So now I've got my two separate pots of boiling water going, one for my white beans, one for my pinto beans. I don't want to mix these up. And as I mentioned, I'm going to try two different processing methods. One includes just boiling them for 30 minutes, which is one of the more commonly known methods. And then another one is just packing them after being soaked into jars and then ladling hot boiling water into those jars and letting them pressure can that way. So I just want to try both methods to see how I like the beans, if I prefer one method over the other. I am going to go ahead and measure this out in half cup increments. That way I kind of know the approximate amount that I'll be canning up in each of my jars using both methods. Usually the rule of thumb, and this again depends on the bean. Sutton Days does an excellent side-by-side comparison of all of the different types of beans and how much they expand overnight by soaking. Pinto beans don't expand that much. White beans also don't expand that much, but lima beans, for example, butter beans, those expand a lot. So it really just kind of depends on the bean type, that depending on how much expansion occurs in the jar. and how much headspace and room you need to leave in order to let them expand appropriately or let them absorb water. Really, what's occurring is they're absorbing water. That's what causes the expansion. Okay, so I went ahead and put right around 2.5 cups of pinto beans in one pot. I'm going to let that come to a boil for 30 minutes. Next, I'm going to go ahead and measure out a few cups of the white beans. It's 1 cup. All right, so I'm going to let those boil. I can already hear my water simmering away in here. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off for now. It will heat up again pretty quickly. In the meantime, I can get out my canning jars and can up these, which are now ready to be canned. So here are my rinsed beans that I am not boiling. The ones that I am boiling right now are on the stove with a timer set for 30 minutes. These ones I am going to put in the can. And again, this is an experiment to see which method I like best and what texture kind of results in the best for me. Really, it all depends on what your preference is. If you prefer your beans that can be easily mashed up for refried beans, then perhaps boiling them is the better route to take. So right now I'm going to go ahead and fill up my jars. Now again, these beans here have been soaked but not boiled, so they will expand. The Ball Blue book here on preserving is very vague in their instructions on how many beans or how much quantity of beans should be filled up in each jar. In fact, they don't specify it at all. So that left me kind of scratching my head like, wait a second, I thought beans expanded, so I actually didn't know what to do. And when I first started out with canning, I ruined a jar because I filled it all the way and left no room at all, thinking that that must be the way it's done. And that was not it at all. I actually ended up having to toss that jar because the beans became so compacted in there, I couldn't get them out. So again, these will expand as they cook and absorb water. So here I have a 1/2 cup. I'm going to go ahead and use a funnel. You can get these at a local hardware store, order it online. This is a funnel for placing items into the jar. So that's that's 1 cup, and that fills it up just a quarter. I know this is a quart jar. I know this can take probably right around half the amount. So I am going to go ahead and put 2 cups in here. And I like that amount. I would rather there be more liquid than not enough for my preference. I would rather that these beans have enough liquid to absorb rather than not any or not enough left to absorb and they dry out at the top. That's not what I want. I want to make sure that every single one of these beans has the option to pull in water to make it soft and chewy and flavorful when you open up the jar. So I'm going to go ahead and put, that's 2 cups. So you can see that's right around just a little bit more than half. And I will do, since I have such a small amount, I will do this pint jar here that I have. And this also is about a half. So that's a good amount, leaving plenty of space for these beans to expand. So I will go ahead and set this aside. In the meantime, I do have a kettle of water going that I will use to pour into these jars to get them to a good temperature to place them into the pressure canner. So next I'm going to go ahead and move on to my white beans. Here they are rinsed. There are a few other bean varieties in there that came in the bag, but no biggie. It's a nice mix. Here, I'm actually going to start with pint jars because I think serving size wise, that might be best for our family. A quart size is a lot to go through. And if I open it up in the fridge, then I'm going to feel like I have to eat it that week because beans don't hold that well in the fridge for that long. So just something to keep in mind. 1/2 cup here. I'm going to do a little bit more. So this is a little bit more than half. And I will go ahead and leave it like this so that way it has room to expand. So you can see. Maybe a little bit more. Looks good. It's about 2/3. And I've got a little bit left over. What I think I'm going to do with these is just dump them in the pot that's boiling. Let's actually check on the beans, see how they are doing. I want to see how soft these are. So I can already see these are pretty soft. Those are the pinto beans. White beans are also pretty soft. We are at 23 minutes left, so quite a while to go. And you can see they're already shelling. The shells are coming off. So they are cooking pretty quickly here. White beans probably not as quickly. I will leave them a little bit longer. Just want to do a time check. We only have 9 minutes left and the beans are looking pretty soft already. I may go ahead and just end the 30 minutes and make it 20 minutes because they are really soft. So the white beans are holding their shape a little bit better, but the pinto beans are really falling apart. So I think these are good. I really do. So I am going to go ahead and turn these off, drain the water, and then can them up and add fresh boiling water to my jars. Here we have the pinto beans. You do not need to rinse these once they come out of the pot. Okay, so now I've got my pinto and white beans as well as my remaining pint and quart jars. One note about these, you do want to make sure that these are clean and sterile, having just come out of the dishwasher or just cleaned from your most recent use. So at this point, this is kind of the key differentiating point in this method versus the previous method that I just did. Here again, these are soaked overnight, but not boiled for 30 minutes. And notice that they are only filled up to about 2/3. This method, however, because these have now been boiled, I can actually fill up the jar all the way. And this is the most confusing part that the Ball Blue Book does not explicitly state, or really many different canning resources, official canning resources, does not explicitly state that once they have been boiled, they've really started to absorb a lot of water. And so you can go ahead and fill them up. That part is confusing. I'm going to go ahead and get water boiling again in the kettle. And you do want to use boiling water simply because the pressure canner temperature is boiling, so you don't want there to be a really great separation or degree of difference between the two temperatures that can cause shock and cause the glass to actually burst. So I'm going to go ahead and get my funnel. This might actually work for the entire jar. And I know that because if I press down on this, you can see that the bean is soft and the texture is kind of mushy. That tells me that the bean is pretty close to being cooked all the way because it's been boiled for 30 minutes. So I am not worried about filling this up all the way because I know it's gone through most of the water absorption process. So that's one lesson that I've learned. Oops, I found a little thing here. One lesson that I've learned just from my own experiences canning beans, and I am by no means an expert canner. In fact, I would still consider myself somewhat of a beginner, just being completely honest. I am just in my second or third year canning. So, and I've only canned beans a handful of times. So, just one thing that I'm noticing here is that the beans already are very soft. So that tells me, cool, I can fill it up all the way. I do have more pint jars. I'm so excited. I have this one that's a wide mouth, and this is a narrow mouth. There are two different types, wide mouth and narrow mouth. This has a different type of lid, and this is a wider lid. So just something to keep in mind as you start canning. There are two different types. I like the wide mouth because it's easier to get items in, to funnel items in, and it just offers more real estate. So these are both clean. So I'm going to go ahead and transfer some of these into this jar. And you want to leave about 1 inch headspace, meaning that right below the rim, this is like the shoulder, it's called, there's about 1 inch headspace. Perfect. It's like it was meant to be. I'm going to go ahead and can up this pint-sized jar. Here again, this is a perfect example of the shoulder, that curve, that's the shoulder. This is the neck. So again, leaving about 1 inch headspace. My water in my kettle is boiling. I'm going to go ahead and line these up here. Now I'm noticing that these ones are already pretty cold because they were only soaked, not boiled. So I am going to go ahead and place a towel underneath these because we're on my tile countertop. If you have like a tile countertop that gets pretty cold, try to place a towel underneath it, and that way you avoid any risk of glasses bursting as the hot water is poured in there into the jar. So right now I've got all my jars that are only half full that are cold placed on a towel. These are already very warm. I'm not worried about that. I have my lids soaked here. I'm realizing that I do need a narrow lid, which I did not plan for. Let me see if I can find one. Okay, I found some. These are canning lids regular mouth. So there's wide mouth and regular mouth. And these I got at Ace Hardware. So you will again need your canning lids. Canning lids can really only be used once because they won't hold their seal again. There's like a glue on the outside of it that won't hold the seal. I know that there are reusable canning lids, which I think is fantastic. I have not yet tried them. Okay, so I've got my boiling water here. I'm going to go ahead and fill up all of these, again, to about 1 inch headspace. I can hear my pressure canner. The water is boiling away in there. So while we wait for the water to boil, I can go ahead and get these jars closed. You will need some type of vinegar. I happen to have white wine vinegar on hand. You can use distilled vinegar, really anything that you happen to have on hand. And the purpose of that is to clean these rims to make sure that there's no residue on there, remove any bacteria, so that way it creates the opportunity for a perfect seal when it is being pressure canned. So I'm going to go and do that. One other key step that I almost forgot is to debubble the food in the jars. You can get an actual debubbler they sell as part of the canning kits, which comes with this, the actual funnel, and a debubbler, which is just basically like a plastic stick. I'm going to go ahead and use a skewer. Basically, you push it down along the edges, and it removes any air bubbles that might be trapped in the jar itself. So that way it reduces the risk of bacteria forming and growing in the jar and just allows for a more shelf-stable product and the longevity of the product. think debubbling also prevents siphoning, which occurs when water leaks out, preventing a proper seal. So I believe debubbling also helps prevent that too. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and place my rims on my clean jars. And take my rims, or I'm sorry, put my seals on my clean jars, take my rims and screw them on, making them fingertip tight. Woo, did you hear that seal? That just sealed. That would not be a proper seal, so it has to go through the pressure canning process. Okay, so I've got the rest of my water boiling, and I think we're almost ready to fill up the remainder of the jars. This was not used. I just happened to use this for a Valentine's Day project where I wrote love notes to my kids. So it wasn't used, just as an FYI. If you're seeing this heart here, that's because it was used for Valentine's Day. Okay. Filling up my remaining jars. Again, 1-inch headspace. And you see all those bubbles forming? That's a key indicator to me that I really need to debubble that jar before sealing it. And actually what happens quite often when debubbling occurs is that the water level decreases because the air bubbles take up so much space in the jar. So I find that I have to top it off sometimes with water. That's not uncommon if you happen to encounter that. This is a perfect example of a lid that I can tell is no longer viable for use. And I don't know if this somehow got into the pile, but you can see what happens as well, that when this has been used, the rims will often warp, and this will prevent a proper seal from occurring. And if it's not noticed, the rims will actually create like a false seal and give the illusion that it is sealed when in fact it is not. So I know I can't use this because you can see how warped this is. Same thing with this one. Somehow these must have been used and gotten into the mix of things, but this one is nice and straight. I just placed this lid on there to get this up to a boil, which is where you want it to be. And you can see the water level is not very high at all. In fact, it's decreased quite a bit. You do want to make sure that you have the aluminum liner down placed at the bottom. If you do invest in a pressure canner, I'd highly recommend one that allows you to double stack. If you're going to make the investment, get that one because you can can that much more on your first round instead of having to do single batches, which takes up a lot of time. So here I've got my canning tongs, and I'm going to go ahead and place my first jar in. And again, because we are pressure canning, the jars should not be submerged. They should really only be filled up to about anywhere between 3 and 5 inches, depending on the size of the jars. This canner does allow me to get 7 on the bottom layer using pint jars, which is pretty nice. You want to make sure that they are not touching each other. Now I've got 1 quart left, so I'm going to go ahead and get my liner. So this is also a liner that comes with many canning kits, and this basically allows you to place the liner here and then put your jars in and then submerge it. For the purposes of this, since I only have 1 quart jar left, I'm just going to go ahead and collapse the handles and then place this quart jar right on top, which I am noticing now is too tall. And I think what the problem is that I have this small jar here, which is actually slightly taller than some of the others. So let's see if I can make this work. No, still too tall. Bummer. I think anyways. Let me try it. It will work. Fantastic. Just to give you an idea, you can see the water down there is only about 3 inches. I think I might actually fill it up just a smidge more. A lot has boiled off, and I want to make sure that I don't run into an issue where I'm cooking the beans and the pressure canner actually runs out of water. So you can see the water is higher. I'd say it is now about a good 4 inches or so, which is great. There are arrows right here, and that lines up with the arrow here. So I know that it needs to line up in order to make that seal. So now that I have sealed my canner, I want to make sure that it's locked, and then I want to turn it up to a high heat, which it is. I'm going to let the vent steam for 10 minutes. So I can already see that steam is coming out of there. I'll set a timer for myself for 10 minutes. And then once that is complete, I'll put my weighted gauge on here. And then I will bring the pressure to 10 pounds, which essentially means that this dial here has to get up to 10 pounds. Since I'm processing both pint and quart jars, the rule of thumb really is if you're processing 2 different sizes, always process to the largest size. So in this case, I will have to process for 1 hour and 30 minutes instead of the 1 hour and 15 minutes. Now, the downside of this is that it might result in a more mushy bean in my pint jars, but that's okay. I'm going to be using them for refried beans, so no big deal. But just something to keep in mind if you're concerned about texture and really retaining the actual structure of the bean. Okay, so my timer just went off, so I'm going to go ahead and place my 10-pound, my weighted gauge on here, and then as pressure builds, this will reach the 10-pound gauge. I do have it on fairly high heat right now, but as the pressure builds, it will actually exceed the 10 pounds if I'm not careful. So I want to make sure I monitor this and make sure it doesn't go into the 15 or 20 pound range. So it may actually end up being shifted down to the medium or low heat. And now I will go ahead and set my timer for 90 minutes, which is an hour and a half for quart jars. Again, I'm erring on the side of caution and processing the largest size container that's in here, even though I have pint jars, which actually only calls for an hour and 15. We have only been pressure canning for 4 minutes, and I am quickly approaching that 10-pound marker. In fact, I will quickly exceed it. I am going to go ahead and turn down this heat to probably about a medium on my stovetop. And I can hear the bubbles slow down a bit inside. So hopefully that will keep the pressure at 10 nice and steady. I don't want it exceeding it because I don't want the beans to be so cooked that they're completely dissolved and just completely mush. Here's a perfect example of how this weight gauge goes beyond the 10 pounds because the heat is just simply too high. I'm going to go ahead and turn it down to low now, and it should bring it down to 10 pounds. So we are now downstairs in my basement, right in front of my pantry. And as you can see, I'm surrounded by toys. We're actually in the corner of my children's play area, and I really want to get this pantry out of this room to prevent any accidents from happening. So I've gone ahead and assembled a shelf unit in the back by my spare refrigerator that I want to show you. So here is a shelving unit that I purchased off of Amazon. I will link it below. It was really easy to assemble. It took me about 10 minutes. There are no screws. You just kind of snap these plastic rods into each shelving area, and it assembles in no time. So I highly recommend this one. It seems very durable. Now, since I'll be using this as a pantry, I went ahead and used the box that it came in and cut out some cardboard strips. That way I can just lay my canning jars right on top of here because it does have kind of some divots in the shelving unit itself, and I don't want the cans to, or the jars rather, to inadvertently tip over and fall. So this is in the back section of my basement. It's pretty cool and dry down here. It's right across from my refrigerator. So now my pantry can kind of be centralized. And I don't have a large pantry. I have a pretty small pantry. It will likely take up 1 to 2 shelves. And in the meantime, I can use the remaining shelves for other storage items. But again, my goal is to build my pantry over time. That's my goal for 2025. So I'm really excited. Let's get started with this. To make transport easier, I'm going to go ahead and use the box that these mason jars came in and really try to stack as many as I can here in the box at a time. That way I don't have to make so many trips back and forth. Another thing that I've done to keep better track of my pantry is to create an inventory. And this is a very rudimentary inventory. I realize there are many apps out there that allow you to do this in a much more efficient way, but I know that this inventory tracker will actually be used by the members of my household who grab items from this pantry. So it's a very basic way to track the items, and I by no means have a large pantry. So if I had a much larger one that was much more established, then I might look into an app, but for now this does the job. So here you can see, like, I've outlined tomato sauce, green beans, carrots, how many I actually started with, and then how many I've used so far. And what this inventory does, it allows me to be much more strategic about how many items I actually can and how many I use for the entire growing season. That way, if, for example, we run out of tomato sauce in March, for example, I'll know that I need to actually can, X number more to last me until I can get my hands on some fresh tomato sauce by July or August. So this way I can really kind of gauge how much my family needs and how much we actually use. So if, for example, I find that we just don't eat that many carrots, I probably won't can that many carrots next year. So it's just kind of a learning curve depending upon your flavor choices, who you're feeding in your family, and what your goals are. So I'm really excited for this, and I'll just go ahead and probably hang this or lay this on the jars, and that way whoever grabs jars here will just mark it off and we can kind of keep track of what we're using. Overall, I am really pleased with the end result. I think it looks great. It's actually a lot more than I realized that I had canned, which is exciting for me because, as I mentioned, I'm a relatively new canner. I've only been doing this a couple of years and not fully. Mind you, I still supplement either via the grocery store or by another farm nearby. So it is really cool to see the fruits of my labor kind of come to this point and where I can feed my family from it. So here we have tomato sauce, some pickled items, carrots, green tomatoes, my green beans, more carrots and beets down here, and my one lonely butternut squash. So hopefully I can create an even bigger pantry this year. That is my goal, and I will take you all along. It should be fun. So perfect timing, our timer just went off. We were able to set up the pantry in the perfect amount of time. I went ahead and turned off the heat, turned off my timer. I will let the gauge go down to 0. Once it does that, I will go ahead and remove this weighted gauge for 5 minutes and just let everything cool before I go ahead and unlock everything. Okay, so my pressure gauge is now at 0. I'm going to go ahead and remove the weighted gauge. And you can see the steam come out. I'm going to go ahead and let that completely cool for about 10 minutes or so, and then I will go ahead and remove the jars. So now that the steam has completely emptied out of the pot, I'm going to go ahead and unlock this top, remove it, and now I'll go ahead and remove the jars. You can see them still in the pot here. Looks like we did not have any siphoning, so that is great. I have a towel here just to prevent any shock to the glass jar. If there's a big temperature difference, you want to put a towel underneath or some type of heating pad so that way the glass doesn't burst. These look great. These look fantastic. So you can see the liquid is still bubbling in here and the water will continue to absorb as the jar cools. but so far it really looks fantastic. So you can see they really expanded to the full size of the jar. So the experiment really proved my method that soaking them but not cooking them allows the bean to expand, but then cooking them does make a little bit more of a mushier, softer bean. So like this, for example, I can tell this one was cooked for 30 minutes because the beans are that much more soft and broken down. Here's an example of where there is a lot of liquid left and the beans are pretty broken down. That tells me that maybe the jar wasn't full enough or that the water is still absorbing, or maybe, this particular jar just has excess water. I'm not entirely sure, but the important thing is that it is sealed and that the liquid hasn't leaked out. So you can see the water is quite a lot less, probably just an inch or so, but it is clear. So that means that no liquid siphoned out of these jars, which is pretty important. That means I should have a proper seal on every single one of these. This is pretty exciting. So we've got 4 jars of white beans and 3 pint jars. Oh, did you hear one seal? That was a seal. And 1 quart jar and then 3 pint jars of the pinto beans. So it is the next day. The jars have cooled and I've cleaned them. I've removed the rims and they look great. Let me take you up close and show you what they look like. So here are the jars and you can see these 2 are the white beans that were not boiled for 30 minutes but put directly into the jar after soaking for 12 to 18 hours. And these ones are clearly the ones that were boiled. So you can see how much more these break down in the jar after being pressure canned than these do. These really hold their shape nicely. So just something to keep in mind depending on what you're planning in your recipes, depending on the texture of the bean that you're going for. Here are the remainder of the beans. These beans broke down all fairly evenly. This quart jar a little bit more than the others. So it's a little bit more difficult to tell which ones were boiled and which ones were pressure canned directly. I think these are the ones that were boiled, if I'm not mistaken, because they just look so much more broken down than the others. But overall, I am really pleased with this. Thanks for joining me today as I pressure can these beans and gave my pantry a brand new transformation. I'm really excited. These little things help me stay organized. I hope these help you stay organized, and it's fun to do these with other people as well. If you're into gardening, preserving, check out my other videos. I'll link a few in my description of the video below, and stay tuned for more upcoming gardening projects. I'd really appreciate if you hit that subscribe button, like this video, please share. It really helps me grow my channel. And as always, I appreciate your support and really enjoy this community. And as always, let me know in the comments how you're harvesting your produce, what you're doing with your produce, what type of preservation methods you use, and what your gardening projects are for this upcoming gardening season. I'll see you in the next video. Until next time, bye friend.